Hey, cool kids. Welcome back into the Cool Grandpa podcast. I am excited to have you with me today. And I hope you've got a nice coffee, some tea, that you've got some time that you can sit down with me and, talk over a topic that I think is really important to a number of us. But before we get to that, I want to remind you, please, if you haven't done so already, go over to YouTube, like and subscribe the Cool Grandpa channel. That helps me hit a milestone that I'm really getting close to hitting. But I'd love for you to go over there and support me so that it shows up in that YouTube feed. The other thing I'd like to remind you of is please go over to my bookstore at cool-grandpa, and you can check out all the cool merch that I've got there, the polo shirts, the hats, the mouse pad, the koozies now, and many other items that both grandfathers as well as kids. I've got some toddler shirts and some infant shirts over there. Just go ahead and check that out. Any purchase there helps support the show, and I really do appreciate your support of this podcast. Today I think we're going to dive into one of the most painful experiences that a grandfather can face, and that is being separated from your adult children and being separated from your grandchildren. Sometimes it's us watching birthdays pass, watching holidays come and go, and seeing family photos online and wondering what stories are being told when you're not in the room. For some of you listening today, this isn't a hypothetical discussion. It's what you're currently experiencing. And I'm sorry that you're going through that chapter. Before we go any further, though, I also want to say something that may surprise you. This episode's not going to be about blame. It's not going to be about deciding who is right. It's not even primarily about estrangement. It's it's about hope. At least that's what I hope that you take away from this, because as long as people are alive, our stories are still being written. Relationships can change, hearts can be softened, understanding can grow. And even when reconciliation isn't immediate, you can still become the kind of grandfather whose legacy brings healing instead of hurt. And I know that's tough because sometimes that reconciliation with the people that you really want to draw closer to again, sometimes honestly, that it just doesn't work out. But I'm hoping that if that's the case in your circumstances, that you at least are able to become and choose to become the best person, the best grandfather, the best grandmother, the best grandparent that you can be, that your other relationships can maybe be strengthened by any changes that you make. So today we are talking about broken relationships, but we're going to end I think somewhere more important than just talking about broken relationships. We're going to talk about second chances. Family estrangement has become increasingly common. There's a number of reasons for it, and I've gone into some of those with guests and with my solo podcast. And so I don't really want to necessarily dive into what's making and what are causing some of those things. You can use your own imagination, your own knowledge, your own stories about that. But researchers such as Carl Piltner at Cornell University have documented that family estrangement affects millions of Americans. And I know that's going to be millions worldwide as well. Many studies suggest that roughly 1 in 4 adults have experienced some kind of estrangement from a family member during their lifetime. As fathers are disproportionately represented in that statistic. And statistics don't tell you what it feels like when your grandson starts Little League and you're not invited to be there. Statistics don't tell you what it feels like when Thanksgiving comes around and you're wondering if your daughter is thinking about you at all or is sad about the relationship that is broken. Statistics don't tell us how many men quietly carry grief without talking about it. Many grandfathers suffer alone, and it's not just with estrangement, it's with a number of other things as well. I think the statistics and the research show that As men get older, we tend to suffer more in silence and we tend to lose relationships. And that's not necessarily estrangement, that can be anywhere from retirement to moving to just changing lifestyles, whatever it might be. I think men tend to suffer a little bit more of that isolation than women do. Not because we want to, but because I think a lot of us don't know where to take that pain. Many of us grew up in environments where it was expected that we would be able to solve problems. We fixed things, we provided, we endured, but nobody taught us really what to do when the thing that is broken is a relationship. You know, for some of it, a lot of those broken relationships or those severed ties had to do with what I said, changes in work, changes that we went through. But it's hard for us to really grasp, how to manage when that relationship takes a turn for the worse, especially when we didn't want or expect to walk away from it. When that relationship involves a child and possibly our grandchildren, that's especially hurtful and sometimes leaves us wondering what's going on. One of the hardest truths in a family that is starting to go down the path of reconciliation is this: many estranged fathers are not bad men. Many times they're good men, hardworking men. They sacrifice, and they're men who genuinely love their families. But yet, that love and connection are not always the same thing. A father can love deeply and still struggle to communicate that love. A grandfather can care profoundly for their family and still unintentionally create distance. Sometimes that problem wasn't cruelty, sometimes it was emotionally absent, not knowing what to do. And sometimes it was criticism that was delivered as advice. One of the things that we talk about is making sure that we know boundaries and that we're listening and that we are careful with how we phrase things so that it's delivered as advice without having that critical part to it. And sometimes what we end up doing is that we let our pride get in the way. Sometimes we're believing that providing financially was enough, that that was our role. Sometimes it was carrying wounds from our own childhood that were never really addressed and that we just carried forward. And sometimes men just don't know what to do or how to do it or what's needed most by their children and grandchildren. I've heard countless stories from fathers who eventually realized, my child didn't doubt that I loved them. They doubted whether I understood them. And that's a very different issue. Fortunately, it's an issue that I think can sometimes be repaired. I've noticed something interesting in the stories of reconciliation that I've experienced and that I've seen and heard about. And that breakthrough often begins when somebody stops asking who is right. What did I do wrong? Why are they so thin skinned? And the person starts asking, what can I learn from this? And that's a powerful shift. I know that one grandfather in particular who described spending years replaying every single argument that they had and every single conversation with their adult children in their mind and couldn't figure out what was going on, what they did. He spent years proving to himself that what really happened was not truly his fault. And about 6 years went by where he was waiting for an apology, or at least for his daughter to approach him to start mending that relationship. And then as we were talking, he told me that started to ask a different question, first internally and then externally. What if my goal is to understand and not focus on who's right or who's wrong? And he said that seemed to change everything for him. Not right away, but it started to evolve. That, understanding doesn't require agreement. Understanding doesn't require surrendering your principles. After all, as an outsider, might even agree with you and your point of view, but does it really matter if the result is a separation? Understanding just means that you're curious enough to listen to another person's experience or perspective. I think curiosity with understanding has rebuilt many relationships that were certainly destroyed. And really, it's asking that question about, well, how did you take this? What was going on? Why did this happen? It's asking those open-ended questions, both for yourself as well as the other person who has that relationship that you're trying to mend. And this story has nothing to do with grandfathers, but yet it has everything to do with grandfathers. And it's the story of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. I know we've got the United States 250th birthday is just right around the corner. And I've known this story, but I want to share it with you because I think it ties in really well. For those of you that may not know American history real well, Adams and Jefferson were both part of the group that would be called the Founding Fathers. There are two men that helped build America. They both did things similar and differently from each other, meaning they were both diplomats, they were both presidents, they were both very instrumental in the American Revolution, developing the idea of what would become American democracy. And these two men also signed that Declaration of Independence. Again, we're coming up on 250 years, which is pretty substantial for a democracy. Most democracies don't last that long, but yeah, these two men, they signed the Declaration of Independence, and they spent years working side by side for a cause that was bigger than themselves. It was a hope, it was an idea that democracy could be revived in the world, that it could be implemented in a way that liberties, that freedoms, that self-governance could take hold. And in many ways, they admired each other, even though Adams was older than Jefferson by about 13 years, I think. They did respect each other and they needed each other. But over time, their politics, their disagreements, their competing visions for the country, and wounded pride on both sides really drove them apart. What had once been a very close friendship had become a rivalry. The distance grew between them, the arguments intensified. Eventually, they stopped speaking to each other altogether. And for more than a decade, they had nothing to do with each other, even though if I remember right, they would maybe send letters to each other's wives and to friends, and they kept those relationships, but that direct relationship between Adams and Jefferson was really severed for over a decade. And I just want you to imagine that you're fighting about politics and ideas, and wounded pride kept these two people that had been so close away from each other for over a decade. And neither one of them was obviously entirely wrong. They were simply human, and they had different ideas about the direction that they thought the country should go, and about governance, and about how best to support a young nation. And I think, like many estranged family members, they became convinced that the other person should make the first move to repair that relationship. And over a decade after they really stopped talking to each other, a mutual friend encouraged them to reconnect. And in 1812, Adams wrote the first letter to Jefferson, not because every issue had been resolved. They were very old men at this point, but I think because they were able to start to reconnect. And Adams, he valued the relationship more than the argument. And Jefferson wrote back, and over the next 14 years, they exchanged more than 150 letters, maybe more, but at least we've got documentation on about 150 letters between Adams and Jefferson after their estrangement. In those letters, they talked about faith and politics, about getting older, about regrets, about the future of the nation, and the process that they rebuilt something that many people thought were lost forever. They rebuilt their friendship. And one of my favorite parts of the story is that neither man really changed their core beliefs. Adams didn't suddenly become a Jeffersonian, thinking that small farmers, that the yeomen, that those people were the ones that should really manage the country. And Jefferson probably didn't change Adams' mind at all about strong central government, about a Yankee democracy. And Yankee mean, that New England view of democracy. So that reconciliation didn't require a complete agreement on so many different things, but what it required was regaining mutual respect for each other, humility, and the willingness to start again. And I want you to think about that for a moment. If two of the most influential men in American history could spend years separated by pride and disagreement, yet find their way back to one another, what does that tell us about our own families? And what does it tell us about our own chances of rebuilding relationships? I hope that means that you have maybe a little bit more optimism about reconciliation than maybe you had when you started listening to me. Maybe reconciliation isn't about proving who's right and who's wrong. Maybe it's about deciding that the relationship itself matters more than the scorecard. You know, Adams and Jefferson reminds us that sometimes the most meaningful conversations in life happen after the conflict, after the hurt, after the silence, when someone finally decides to reach across the distance and say, "Hey, let's start over again." You know, movies often portray reconciliation as one dramatic conversation. And I think in real life, it's usually different. Reconciliation is often slow. It may begin with a letter, a text, a birthday card, seeing each other at an event that brings people together. Maybe it's a grandchild's recital. Maybe it's something else that brings people into the same proximity, and then they start with just being cordial to each other. And sometimes it's a simple statement such as just, "Hey, I've been thinking about you and our relationship. I miss you. I'd like to understand your perspective better." I think those words are powerful because they're not demands, they're invitations. And many adult children don't need perfection from us. They need to feel safe. They need to know that if they reconnect, they won't be criticized. They won't be lectured. They won't be manipulated. They'll be heard. Trust is rarely rebuilt in one moment. Like I said, typically it starts out very slowly and then it just rebuilds that relationship. And what we end up with is, I think talking about how the grandchildren see that process, because that's where many grandfathers feel the deepest ache, is when the grandchildren know that there's a rift and but they don't understand why. And here's what I want every grandfather to remember: children learn from stories, not just the stories we tell, but the stories we live. Imagine someday asking your grandchild, asks, what happened between grandpa and dad? Maybe they're asking grandma, maybe they're asking mom, what story do you want them to hear? What do you want them to hear about a man who held on to resentment? A man who, do you want that to be what they understand, that, grandpa just got mad at dad for some reason and just never forgave him? Or do you want that story to be told that, you were somebody that experienced a rift, that there was a boundary violation, that there was behavior, something that caused that separation, but that you were the one that pursued peace, and that you were the one that pursued trying to mend that relationship? Even if the reconciliation takes years, your response today to these questions about what do you want your story to be is helping to shape that legacy that you will have and that you will leave down the road, and for the grandchildren to really notice. I think grandchildren notice and they view a lot more than what we think. They notice the humility, they notice kindness, they notice forgiveness, and they notice growth both within their parents as well as within their grandparents. So I want to jump over and talk a little bit about the good news about the second half of life, and about reconciliation here. And one of the beautiful things I think about becoming a grandfather is that you get a bigger perspective, and you guys have heard me talk about, when you're a parent, it's very tactical. It's very, how do we get the kids to school? How do we pay the mortgage today? How do we work our careers? How do we do these things? And then becoming a grandfather really kind of just opens things up. And I don't know necessarily why that happens. It may be an age thing, it may be just a different role that we evolve into. But by the time we reach the season of life, we've learned something important, that being right is really kind of overrated when it comes to relationships, that our pride can sometimes cost us too much. And, time moves way too fast, especially as we get older. I mean, it's already June and it feels like yesterday was just February. So, I think as we get older, it feels like life moves faster. And love and respect are almost always worth another attempt. I've seen people reconcile after years apart, that they've been able to make up with adult children, with friends, with even grandchildren. And I've seen that change within both people. And typically that change is really for the best. Meet grandchildren that they thought they would never know, that it had been years and years since the grandchildren were born. And there was this thing in the back of the grandfather's mind when I was talking with them, that they would never know that grandchild. They would never know their personality, their quirks, the thing that makes that grandchild special. And then at some point, that reconciliation happens, that softening happens. And even though we're focusing on the grandfather side of things, a lot of that too happens with the adult children, that they change, that they start to reach out, that they start to rebuild imperfect relationships very slowly. And I understand that not every story ends that way, so I don't want this to be a Pollyanna type conversation that you and I are having. But what I want to do is I want you to have hope that no matter what your circumstances are, I've seen relationships that can be turned around. I've seen some things that I thought people would never get over, and they slowly got over. And that doesn't mean that you forget, especially if there was some terrible actions on one side or the other, but it means that you kind of reestablish a new relationship, that you can still grow as a grandfather or grandparent, and you can still heal, and you can still let go of the hard feelings that you have, and forgive yourself if maybe you're the one that caused the rift between you and whoever that you want to have a relationship. So I want you to understand that you can still leave a legacy worth remembering, even though it's going to be tough to get through that mending process, that it's going to be a slow process, that it's sometimes going to be painful, because you're going to have to recognize what caused the rift to start with. And that's not easy for a lot of people to do. And, okay, I've rambled on about that enough. So here's what I want to do. I want to give you your Paul Harvey moment. For those of you in the United States, Paul Harvey was a guy that would come on and tell a story similar to what I was telling you about Adams and Jefferson. And so I want to kind of start to wrap this conversation up with some more information about that Adams and Jefferson rift and how they mended that. And to me, one of the most remarkable details of our American history is that both John Adams and Thomas Jefferson died on July 4th, 1826, 200 years ago this year. And it was also the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. So you know that these men had seen a lot. They'd gone through the American Revolution. They'd gone through seeing the American frontier stretch from Western New York all the way into Illinois and the Mississippi area. Jefferson, of course, Lewis and Clark, sending them across to the Pacific to scout out the Louisiana Purchase and what America was going to become in the future. They lived to be old men that saw an awful lot in their time. And especially if we just go from July 4th, 1776 to July 4th, 1826, to the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And to me, that fact makes the reconciliation story even more powerful. After years of friendship, a bitter political rivalry, and more than a decade of silence, they reconnected in 1812 and spent the last 14 years of their lives exchanging letters. Those letters reveal two aging men reflecting on their successes, their failures, their faith, their politics, their family, mortality, and the future of the nation that they helped to create. I think the legend surrounding their deaths is even more touching, is that, Adams died at age 90 in Massachusetts, which, doing the math, he was 40 years old at the time of the Declaration of Independence and had seen an awful lot living in the Boston area in terms of the very start of the American Revolution. And Jefferson died at the age of 83 in Virginia. And based on what everybody can figure out, Jefferson died a few hours before Adams died up in Massachusetts. The last reported words of Adams were that Thomas Jefferson survives, that Adams wanted one of these founding fathers, and Jefferson being probably one of the strongest from an intellectual perspective and influence perspective, to continue past Adams. And I thought that was really kind of a touching thing. And like I said, what Adams didn't know was that Jefferson had preceded him in death earlier that day. And historians can't verify every detail and the exact wording, but the story has endured because it captures something deeply human. After all their disagreements, after all their years of rivalry, anger, and estrangement, Adams' last thoughts reportedly turned to his old friend and gave him comfort in those last moments, thinking that Jefferson was still around to influence politics quietly, probably from behind the scenes, given their age, but nonetheless was still there. And so I'd like to leave you with one final thought today. Maybe reconciliation starts with a conversation. Maybe it starts with bumping into each other at grandchild's event, maybe a social event, whatever it is, and just acknowledging each other and being civil to each other. And maybe it starts with a letter, as it was the case with Adams and Jefferson. And maybe it starts with some counseling. Maybe it starts with a prayer if you're somebody that prays. Or maybe it simply starts with the courage to take one small step. Not today, not tomorrow, but maybe sometime very, very soon, taking that one small step to send that text message, to reach out, to be cordial to somebody at an event, because none of us know how many opportunities we have remaining to us to heal those relationships that we really value. Otherwise, we wouldn't care about reconnecting. But taking advantage of the time to reach out, to start to reestablish that relationship. And, what I do know is this, that the grandfather your family needed 20 years ago may not be the grandfather you are today. You've learned, you've grown, you've lived. And, that's all good news, because families don't need perfect grandfathers. They need present grandfathers. They need humble grandfathers. They need loving grandfathers. And if there's still breath in your lungs and love in your heart, there's still the possibility of writing a better next chapter in your life and that life of that relationship. It doesn't have to be a perfect chapter, but just a better one. Hey, as I wrap up here, I really want to leave you with a word of encouragement that I've given you some examples. I love the one with Adams and Jefferson, but I want you to know that I understand that reconnecting with people is not easy, especially when they're not ready to reconnect with you. But that doing the part that you can control is probably one of the biggest pieces of work that you can do, so that you can be ready for when that person or when those people are ready for you to re-engage with them, to be a part of their lives again. And I know that's not going to happen for everybody. Everybody's situation's different. But I do have the hope that just by listening to this shows that you're interested in healing wounds that you may have caused, let alone somebody else may have caused that relationship. Thank you for joining me. I know this week's topic was a little bit heavy, but I wanted just to touch base on reconciliation, on separation. And I hope you found some of this inspiring to you. I hope that this has given you some hope that no matter what you're going through, there's still opportunity and time to heal that relationship. And we will be talking about more fun and more interesting things in the future. I promise you that. So I appreciate you sticking with me. And until next time, remember to stay cool.